On the night of November 19th, 1581, in a room in the Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, the fortified palace complex that Ivan the Terrible had made his primary residence precisely because it was easier to defend against the boyar conspiracies he saw everywhere, something happened between a father and a son that the Russian historical record has never been able to fully explain. Not because the basic facts are in serious dispute, but because the specific combination of circumstances surrounding those facts produces a picture so psychologically complex and so medically disturbing that the simple account of a tyrant killing his heir in a fit of rage, which is the version that history settled on, and which Ilya Repin turned into one of the most famous paintings in Russian history, turns out to be almost certainly wrong in its most important details. Even the Fourth of Russia was 51 years old on the night he struck his son, and by every available measure of the historical record, he was a man whose body and mind had been in progressive collapse for years. Before that night, his physical condition, documented in foreign ambassador reports, Russian chronicles, and the testimony of his own physicians, as a man suffering from swollen and painful joints, severe insomnia, episodes of extreme rage followed by periods of deep remorse, an appearance that had aged far beyond his years, and a specific pattern of behavioural deterioration that contemporaries described with increasing alarm as the reign that had begun with genuine promise and administrative capability descended into the paranoid violence of his final decades. Before we go further, if you want history examined the way a forensic scientist examines a crime scene, without the myth and without the sentimentality, subscribe and leave a like right now. Because what the physical evidence says about what happened to Ivan the Terrible, and what happened to his son on that November night, is going to change the way you understand both of them. The Ivan the Terrible that most people know is a construction assembled primarily from the accounts of his enemies, the reports of foreign ambassadors who had political reasons to portray Russian governance as barbaric, and the retrospective condemnations of the Russian Orthodox Church, none of which are unreliable as sources, but all of which need to be understood as representing specific perspectives rather than objective documentation. And what emerges when you strip away the construction and look at what the contemporaneous Russian sources actually say is a ruler who began his reign with a series of administrative and legal reforms, the Sudebnik legal code, the Zemstvo local government reforms, the Stoglov Church Council, that were by any reasonable measure the most sophisticated governance Russia had seen, and that would not be equalled again for generations. The transformation from the reforming young Tsar of the 1550s to the paranoid killer of the Oprichnina terror of the 1560s is the central biographical puzzle of Ivan's entire reign, and the explanation that has been building in the forensic and medical literature for decades, an explanation that the research published after the 1963 Soviet examination of his skeletal remains has made increasingly difficult to dismiss, is that the transformation was not primarily psychological or political, but medical, driven by the progressive accumulation in Ivan's body of heavy metals at concentrations that the 1963 Soviet examination, led by the anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov, found in his bones at levels that modern toxicologists describe as capable of producing exactly the psychiatric symptoms that Ivan's contemporaries documented across the second half of his reign. The specific finding from the forensic examination of Ivan's skeleton that changes the entire moral landscape of his biography is this: mercury was found in his bones at approximately 5 times the normal background level, arsenic was present at significantly elevated concentrations, and lead was found at levels consistent with the same pattern of chronic exposure through medicinal preparations that the forensic examination of Henry VIII's medical records identified as a contributing factor in that king's behavioural deterioration, meaning that Ivan the Terrible and Henry VIII of England, 2 rulers separated by 2,000 miles and 30 years, who are historically linked only by their shared reputation for extreme personal violence and the destruction of the people closest to them, were almost certainly being affected by the same category of medical process at the same point in their respective reigns. The mercury in Ivan's body came from multiple sources, that his physicians would have considered entirely legitimate medical treatment. Mercury-based ointments for syphilis were the standard of care in the 16th century, and the clinical presentation of late-stage syphilis itself includes neurological deterioration, personality change, and psychiatric symptoms that overlap significantly with what Ivan's contemporaries documented, meaning that there is a genuine medical debate about whether the heavy metal poisoning was primary or secondary, whether Ivan was being poisoned by his treatment or by the disease his treatment was attempting to address, a distinction that matters enormously for understanding the trajectory of his decline but not at all for understanding the consequences. The oprichnina, the personal terror apparatus that Ivan established in 1565, a state within a state staffed by his personal agents who wore black and carried brooms and dogs' heads on their saddles as symbols of their function, which was to sweep the country of treason as a dog hunts, is the most extreme institutional expression of Ivan's paranoia, and the specific timing of its creation in the mid-1560s aligns precisely with what toxicologists who have studied the mercury and arsenic evidence describe as the period during which the cumulative neurological effects of heavy metal poisoning would have been reaching the threshold at which behavioural symptoms become consistently severe, creating a situation in which the man who created one of the most brutal domestic terror apparatuses in Russian history may have been doing so with a mind that was being chemically compromised in ways he could not perceive and his court could not diagnose. The relationship between Ivan and his eldest son Ivan Ivanovich, named after his father in the Muscovite dynastic tradition, was by all contemporary accounts genuinely close through most of the younger Ivan's life. The son educated in the same administrative and governmental traditions as his father, participating in military campaigns, showing the capability and political sophistication that would have made him a genuine successor rather than merely a biological heir. And the relationship between them appears to have remained fundamentally intact even through the worst of the oprichnina years, which is what makes the events of November 1581 so specifically confusing to the historical record, because the violence that night did not emerge from a long deteriorating relationship, but apparently from a specific argument whose content the sources describe inconsistently. The specific trigger for the November 1581 confrontation is described differently across the sources available. Some accounts say Ivan struck his son after a dispute about a military campaign in Livonia. Others say the argument was about the younger Ivan's pregnant wife, whom the elder Ivan had allegedly struck earlier the same day in a dispute about her dress being insufficiently modest. Others combine both elements into a single, escalating confrontation, and the inconsistency of the sources on this specific point is not unusual for a court event that all witnesses had strong reasons to misremember or misrepresent. But the inconsistency makes the specific trigger less important than the neurological context in which any trigger, however minor by normal standards, could produce a response that was catastrophically disproportionate. The weapon Ivan used to strike his son was his staff, the iron-tipped staff he carried habitually in his later years, which had already been used in previous acts of violence documented in the historical record, and the blow landed on the younger Ivan's temple, the specific anatomical location where the temporal bone is thinnest, and where a strike from a heavy, metal-tipped implement delivers the maximum force directly to the brain with minimum absorption by the surrounding bone structure, producing the specific type of injury that the contemporary accounts describe in their aftermath. The son conscious, but confused immediately after the blow, deteriorating over the following days, dying on November 19th, 1581, the same day as the blow according to some sources, 11 days later according to others, the discrepancy itself suggesting that the injury was not immediately fatal, but that it produced progressive neurological deterioration, consistent with a traumatic brain injury of significant severity. Ivan's response in the immediate aftermath of striking his son is documented across multiple sources, with enough consistency to be treated as historically reliable. He held his son in his arms on the floor, he called for physicians, he screamed, he wept, he tore at his own beard and hair in the specific gestures of grief that Russian culture associated with genuine and total despair. and the quality of his distress was apparently so extreme and so clearly genuine that the sources which are most hostile to Ivan as a ruler acknowledge it without obvious qualification, because the response of a man who has just realized what he has done to someone he loved is a specific and unmistakable quality of human anguish that is very difficult to perform convincingly, and that witnesses consistently recognized as authentic. The physicians who attended the younger Ivan in the days between the blow and his death included both Russian court physicians and foreign doctors, and what the surviving accounts of their treatment tell us is that the injury was understood from the beginning as serious. The younger Ivan was kept still, treated with whatever measures the medicine of the period could offer, and died despite those measures in a progression that the clinical description of the symptoms maps onto traumatic brain injury, with a consistency that modern neurologists who have examined the accounts find medically coherent rather than dramatized. Ilya Repin's painting Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan, completed in 1885, 3 centuries after the events it depicts, shows the elder Ivan holding his dying son with an expression of absolute horror and the specific quality of a man whose hands have just understood what his mind had not yet processed. And the painting is so psychologically acute in its portrayal of that specific emotional state, the moment between the act and the comprehension of the act, that it became immediately controversial when exhibited, with Konstantin Pobedonostsev writing to the Tsar that it was a slander on the Russian monarchy, with a man attacking the painting with a knife in 1913, and with it being reproduced more than almost any other Russian painting in history, because Repin had captured something true about the specific quality of Ivan's grief, even though the historical accuracy of several of the painting's specific details has been questioned by subsequent scholarship. The question of whether Ivan intended to kill his son, which sounds like a simple factual question, but is actually a neurological one, requires understanding what intention means in the context of a brain operating under the specific impairments that the mercury and arsenic evidence describes, because a man whose impulse control has been progressively compromised by heavy metal poisoning does not choose to act disproportionately in the way a healthy brain chooses actions. His responses to stimuli are amplified, and his capacity to interrupt those responses before they reach their most extreme expression is chemically reduced, which means that asking whether Ivan intended to kill his son is like asking whether Henry VIII intended to execute Cromwell. The action was produced by a mind that had lost the ability to moderate itself, which is not the same as innocence, but is also not the same as the cold, premeditated cruelty that the monster narrative requires. The aftermath of the younger Ivan's death reshaped the entire subsequent history of Russia in ways whose consequences are still visible 7 centuries later, because the heir who died on that November night was by all accounts the most capable of Ivan's sons, the one whose administrative training and political intelligence would have been most likely to maintain the stability of the realm, and his death left the succession to Fyodor Ivan's second son by his first wife, who was by general contemporary consensus so intellectually limited as to be genuinely incapable of the demands of governance, which meant that when Ivan the Terrible died in 1584, the Russian throne passed to a Tsar who required a regent to function, and the regent who filled that role was Boris Godunov, and the instability that followed Boris Godunov's reign produced the Time of Troubles, a decade of civil war, famine, and foreign invasion that killed hundreds of thousands of Russians, and from which the country did not fully recover for generations. Boris Godunov's rise to power through the regency of Fyodor, and eventually to the Tsarship itself after Fyodor died without heir, was made possible entirely by the specific vacancy that the death of Ivan Ivanovich created, because if the younger Ivan had lived and succeeded his father, Godunov's path to power would have been structurally blocked by a capable ruler with legitimate succession, meaning that the blow Ivan the Terrible struck in November 1581 was not merely the personal tragedy that Repin painted, but the specific historical event that determined the shape of Russian governance for the following 3 decades, and that set in motion the chain of events leading to the Time of Troubles, making it one of the most consequential single acts of violence in Russian history. The specific character of Ivan's grief in the years between his son's death in 1581 and his own death in 1584 is documented in the historical record with the specific texture of something that was genuinely incapacitating. He withdrew from governance for extended periods. He composed lamentations. He sent large monetary donations to monasteries, requesting prayers for his son's soul, in the specific formulas of Russian Orthodox memorialization that communicated both genuine religious feeling and the specific guilt of a man who knew he was responsible for the death he was mourning. The forensic examination of Ivan's own skeletal remains, conducted in 1963 by Mikhail Gerasimov's team, in the context of a broader Soviet anthropological project, produced not just the chemical analysis that revealed the heavy metal concentrations, but also a physical reconstruction of Ivan's face and body that provided the first scientifically grounded portrait of what he actually looked like. Replacing the various iconographic representations and foreign descriptions with something derived from the actual bone structure of the man. And what Gerasimov's reconstruction showed was a face of considerable intelligence and forces, strong cheekbones, a prominent brow, a jaw that communicated physical authority, but also the specific physical markers of chronic pain and systemic illness that the documentary record describes. The skeleton of a man who had been unwell for a very long time. The arsenic in Ivan's bones adds a dimension to the medical picture that the mercury evidence alone does not provide, because arsenic poisoning and mercury poisoning produce overlapping but distinct neurological effects. Mercury preferentially damages the cerebellum and the peripheral nervous system, producing tremors, coordination problems, and the specific emotional volatility documented in Ivan's later reign, while arsenic at chronic low doses produces fatigue, cognitive impairment, and the specific pattern of waxing and waning symptoms that could explain the periods of relative clarity and capable governance that appear even in Ivan's final decade between episodes of extreme behavioural deterioration. The debate among Russian historians about Ivan the Terrible's reputation, which the research confirmed is genuinely politically contested, with Russian nationalists arguing that Western historians have systematically exaggerated his cruelty, while Western historians argue that Russian nationalist historiography has systematically minimized. It is ultimately a debate about the same set of facts interpreted through different frameworks. But what the forensic evidence does to that debate is remove its moral center, because if Ivan the Terrible was operating under the specific neurological and psychiatric effects of chronic heavy metal poisoning throughout the most extreme period of his reign, the moral framework of deliberate cruelty versus defensive statecraft that the debate has always assumed becomes secondary to the medical framework of a brain that was being chemically destroyed from the inside. The specific act of striking his son isolated from its medical and historical context looks like the defining act of a monster, the proof of everything the legend says about Ivan the Terrible, and it is the act that has fixed his reputation in the popular imagination more firmly than the Oprichnina, more firmly than the massacre of Novgorod, more firmly than any of the other documented extreme acts of his reign, precisely because it was directed at someone he loved rather than enemies or strangers, and the specific horror of a father killing his own son resonates across every cultural context in a way that political violence against perceived enemies does not, which is why Repin chose it as the subject of his most famous painting, and why it has remained the central image of Ivan's reign for a century and a half. Ivan the Terrible died on March 28, 1584, 2.5 years after his son, in the middle of a game of chess according to the sources, collapsing suddenly at the board in a manner that contemporary accounts describe as consistent with a cardiac event, and the examination of his skeleton confirmed the kind of physical deterioration that a lifetime of heavy metal exposure would produce: arthritic joints, bone damage consistent with chronic inflammation, a body that had been fighting multiple simultaneous systemic assaults for decades. And what the skeleton of Ivan the Terrible communicates to the forensic examiners who have studied it is not primarily the story of a monster, but the story of a man whose body was waging a war it could not win for most of his adult life, a war that cost him his mind, his son, his dynasty's stability, and eventually his life. The painting still hangs in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow, restored after the 1913 knife attack, protected after a second attack in 2018, controversial enough that calls for its removal have been made on political grounds multiple times across the century and a half of its existence. And what it shows, looked at through the lens of what the forensic evidence now tells us, is not the moment of a tyrant's remorse, but the moment of a poisoned man's comprehension. The specific second when the mercury and arsenic and lead that had been dismantling his impulse control for 2 decades produced their final and most personal consequence. And the horror on Ivan's face in Repin's rendering is not the horror of a man who has revealed his true nature, but the horror of a man who has just seen the distance between who he was and who he had become, measured in the weight of his dying son in his arms. And if the specific quality of that horror, the horror of a man destroyed by invisible processes he could not see or name, whose greatest crime was also his greatest grief, whose name became synonymous with terror, while the medical evidence suggests he was simultaneously a perpetrator and a victim of forces that neither he nor anyone around him had the vocabulary to describe. If that is the kind of history that sits with you after the video ends, then you already know that the stories worth telling are rarely the simple ones, and that this channel exists precisely for the history that resists the verdict the legend has already assigned.